You can see it, right? On my left-hand side is my Eclipse. On my right is the GUI practice. Okay. So because I got 3 screens, so if you have a questions, I suggest you to unmute it to tell me, so I don't have to constantly looking into the chat. That would be more efficient this way. So what I would like you to do is let's follow this. This is pretty much a tutorial. So I give you the screenshot, I give you the codes as well. So you could replicate what we will be working on today in class, even, without a lecture, without me talking, behind you. But we are going to work on that side by side, step by step. So the goal for today is to help you to create a very simple GUI. So then you could build from there. You could create more sophisticated, the layout that you want to be, and more button controls or anything, right? But first thing first, we need to string everything together of what we know on creating a Java FX project. We know there is a stage, scene, and node model. So we have to utilize that to create our basic outlook of a window. Once we know how to create a window, next thing is building on top of, every single elements, organize them, create the interactions, which is to handle the event, right? So today we're gonna have a mini practice. I call it GUI practice. So the goal here is that we are going to create a GUI that will allow the user to input into this text field, which is typically we see it, the input box. Once you input something here, what do you do with it, right? You could either click on your key as enter, or you could click on this button, submit button, right? So we're gonna try the submit button first, because button clicking is a very common interactions. And in your assignment 6, you are going to implement quite a few. Right, so again, the goal here is we are going to create this figure 1, a very simple window with the label here to, pretty much set it out, the descriptions. What are you going to do with the input box? With the input box, you could input something, type it in. Once you click on the button, something is going to happen, right? So what's going to happen is very simple. We are just gonna print it out, whatever you type it in. Pretty much echo, whatever you type in. So if we analyze the layout like this, very simple, a window, a label, a text field, a button, 3 components. So I'm telling you, there is going to be a label. You could type it in. So I say type something to prompt your user. Hey, there is this text field coming next. You could type something. Once you type something and you click on the button is going to react to whatever you type. And in our case here, is simply printed out exactly of your input text, okay? So the goal is pretty simple. That's what we want to do. So on your left-hand side here, this is the Eclipse of the Java FX, right? So you could new a Java project, okay, and call it input practice. Okay, just click on finish. So you should see input practice right here. Note it, I ask you to create a Java project instead of Java FX. You could do both, but I say Java project, just like any other project. I want you to feel like this is exactly what you have been working on for your assignment as well. Okay, so input practice project, inside expanded, right? Expanded, you can see the source, there's nothing in it. So now let's create a new class, okay? So just name this class as input practice class, okay? So I also check on this static public void. So a void main, so we have a main method. So we know this is the driver class, okay? And hit finish. So you just see this is what you have. supposed to look like that. Okay, so this is, at this point you should feel very comfortable of doing it. That's already CSU 110. All right, but now we say create a UI. What we do, the step 2, we are already on step 2. To create a UI is having this main method, and we need this class, the entire class. We are going to create this input practice class as the GUI. So you need to extend it, extends to inherit it from application class, the parent class. So at this point, you're gonna see, well, I have the red dots. Let me load it up so you can see it, okay? That's because I have not imported yet, right? So you need to import from JavaFX application library, that class, okay? So once you imported it, it's still, the compiler is still yielding you, yelling at you, there are some errors. What's the potential exception here? That's because we extend from our parents class, we inherit from parents class. What's gonna do is you have to implement. That means this is probably an abstract class. So there must be an actual implementation to trigger, to initiate this GUI. This is where that we need to override a method called public void start with one parameter, stage. Okay, so, well, if you click on the exception, see, it's hinting you, hey, you have not implemented under this application methods, there's a start method, which is what I'm trying to do here. So you still see an error because it's highlighting to you, I have not imported yet the JavaFX, the stage library. So once you imported a proper class, the stage class, then all those exception goes away. Okay, so at this point, that couple things that you need to know for step 2 is we extend, you can highlight it on this PDF here, you extend from application so that this class will officially become a JavaFX application. So we will use it as a driver class, but open it up to drive this class as a GUI. And because application is has the abstract method, that's a start method, you have to implement it. So you have to create this public void start, and this method comes with one argument called stage, primary stage. So we completed it. Step 2. Let's go to step 3. Okay, so now this is the basic JavaFX GUI. Minimally, you need to have these. Now, the third step is, well, we have to start building our driver class now to launch this window, okay, this GUI. So how do you launch the GUI? Look like this, which is just an empty window. If you look at the right-hand side here, I'm circling this window, which is nothing in there, right? So, but we could run this Java application as a GUI. So to do so, you have to invoke a static method in your main method here. This is called static method called launch. And you have to throw in the arguments, which is the default arguments. Okay, so the reason of invoking this static launch methods, that's because we could run it as Java application, or we could run it as JavaFX application. Okay, so these two methods are essential for building a JavaFX application. Okay, now we need to start building everything about this UI layout goes into this start, right? So that means I'm going to put in a couple things here. The first one is to create a scene. So we now know a window, a GUI is about the stage is right here, right? I want to show this stage, but I need to create a scene, which is to organize, to control whatever the elements that we have. So this will be like second thing we need to do to create a scene. Now, once you create a scene, you actually need to assign the parent node, right? To associate what are elements that you need to present it here. So at this point, I haven't, insert anything like a button, text field yet, but I need to have a node. So typically this should be your layout. So what I'm going to do here is to create a scene, and I'm going to call this is my main scene. So Wednesday, I talk about it. You could actually create two windows. Primary stage control the main scene. Secondary stage control the second window, which is controlled by another scene. So I like to call it a main scene, so that you could just new a scene. So within scene, this is where you set up the window, right? So window has, this scene has three parameters. The first parameter supposed to be the parent node. So that's leave it empty there. The second parameter is the size of the width of the window. So I want you to set it to 300 by 300. So what's our parent node here? So as I mentioned, typically is the layout, right? So the layout, let's use the easiest one, the floor plan. Okay, I give you the codes in the PDFL, so I just want you to try to build it. Type it out, it makes a huge difference when you just, read it. So if you couldn't follow exactly what I do, I suggest you to keep notes while I'm operating this, explaining everything. So you can see here, because we have not imported yet. So just import the floor plan, import the scene, then those exceptions should go away. Okay, so now once the scene stage has already established, scene has been created, we need to connect everything together. So you have to use the primary stage dot, I believe it's called set scene. And just call it connect associate with our main scene, right? Once you set the scene, you also need to show it. So these are kind of the minimal lines of codes that you need in order to create a window. Okay, create a window, you need to have a scene. Create the scene, you need to have at least one node. So I'm using this layout pane, floor pan, as my parent node. So I'm putting this pan as my first node, the only node in this application. So at this point, you could right click, run this Java application. And you should see, yay, we got our GUI right here with nothing in it, right? It's basically just a layout. So we are very close to what we want to do. Now let's move on. Any questions so far? So step 1 to step 3 should still quite basic, but that's minimally you need to do to create a Java FX project. Now, step 4 is where we start building more elements into your GUI. Okay, so we say the GUI, look at your figure 1. We have the label, and we also have, we have the label, text field, and the button. So that's why I like to organize all those elements before I set the scene. So that's what I like to put it right below the layout so that I know, hey, this is associated with my layout. So at this point, we could create those 3 elements that we have, the label, just call a label, right? And if you create a label, you could default put in this parameter, which is what's going to display on the label. Or we could just call it user input, right? Or, and you see the exception, that's because you have not imported yet. So import it yet, and import that, and then create a text field and just code it as a input text field. Make sure you import a JavaFX scene control, that library with that class, text field class. And lastly is the button. And so I like to code it submit button, but you could code it whatever you want. So the parameter here is also something the text going to display on the button. So that's called it a submit. So make sure you import all these classes. So now we have these 3 elements that's created, but you are not quite done yet. Once you create the elements, right, those elements has not yet associated within your layout. So make sure at this point you utilize whatever the layout, you have to put it in the floor pan. So you will use fpan.getChildren. So I like to just call dot get and then children and add the nodes in. So the first one is going to be the label. And you have to add all 3 of them. So you could add input after the label, submit button after the label. So now at this point, at least our UI should have all the elements, okay? They are just not doing anything yet, but at least visually you could see it. Okay, so let me organize my codes. That should be exactly what's on your PDF. So you could now run this Java application. There you go. You see the user input. You could type something, hit submit, nothing happened, right? So you should see the label, the testing, input, testing, input. You could click on submit, but nothing happened, right? Okay, so this is a step 4. How make sure that you create the required control elements. And after you created it, make sure they are added to the layout. The layout here we use is floor pan. So I call it fpan. Once that's all added in, you should be able to see your UI. Now, step number 5 is the most exciting part. The first step, what we are going to do is to create an event handler. I'm going to code it as a inner class button handler. So this button handler, what it does is it is going to listen, to wait until whatever this UI has some event. So the event is defined whenever user has the interactions. We talk about it could be a front end event, it could be a foreground event, or back end, the behind the scene. So if you think about the UI, the front end that you see here is this GUI, right? I could type in, I could have some event by hitting my keys. I could have some events by clicking on the button. But back end, I could actually set a timer, right? You have only 10 seconds to type, right? If that's, you know, the program supposed to design. So essentially the event handler here, the step number 5, is trying to decide what happens of your GUI. So this mini exercise, the only thing that's going to happen that we allow to happen is that button click. So that's what we are going to implement. So since we know this is going to be the button click, so I like to create this the button handler right after that. so that I know this is adjacent to what's going to happen of this particular control. So what we do here is after your not right here, sorry. After you associate with all the elements, that you know this button is supposed to have some actions. So what I like to do is to have this submit button to call set action, set on action, excuse me, set on action. And I'm not going to create an anonymous inner classes. I'm going to call a specific inner class so that later I could organize all my events over there. So I'm going to create an inner class by calling a new button handler, okay? So at this point, you probably will see, okay, I don't know what's your button handler. So you have to implement it. So what's going to go into the implementation? You have to go outside this method, right? Outside this start method, but within your input practice class, I'm going to implement a class, which is the inner class. I call it private class button handler. And because this is an inner class, I'm going to utilize the GUI. There is an interface, so implements event handler, and there's a actions. There's a typed abstract typed. You have to implement it. So at this point, you probably see a lot of exceptions. That's because a couple things we have to do. First of all, well, your class doesn't recognize it, so you have to import it, the event handler, okay? There's still an error. What's the exceptions? Well, there are unimplemented methods because the interfaces, they are abstract. So there are a couple methods without implementation. So you have to actually implement the methods here. So here's the handle methods that you have to implement it. So it doesn't recognize your action event, so you have to import it. Okay, so yeah, the inner class is created. That seems fine. Okay, everything looks fine at this point. Any questions so far?
Wait, can you go over that again? What we had to import?
So let me delete everything here, the inner class, right? So I want to associate my submit button with the action. So I'm calling my submit button invoke set action of a new class, which is a button handler.
Right.
The button handler is a new thing that it's a new class that I created because I want this class to organize whatever the buttons events. Okay, so
I think I fixed the issue. I was just trying to figure out. I wasn't sure what you imported to solve your errors. I got it though.
Okay, so typically when you see the exceptions, red dots, on these lines, that means you have a classes or methods not used, not recognized. So you have to import it appropriately.
No,
all right, so at this point, you should have your buttons associated with inner class called button handler. Now, what's going to happen is we are going to say, hey, when you click it, print out whatever you type it in from the text field, right? So inside this handle methods, that's going to be some magic happening for the event, right? So first of all, I need to decide, is the button, is a submit button click, right? So you could use if event that get source will get an object, which is regarding to whatever the event. It could be the text field, it could be the submit button, but tell me which object that has an event. So I use the event that gets source, and I check it to see if this is a submit button. If it's a submit button has an event, then I'll do something with that, right? So here you might notice that, well, how come I'm not recognizing a submit button, right? Because the submit button I was previously declared as a local instance, local button within these start methods, right? So at this point, you probably need to come back up to make sure this button is a class, the visibility is belong to the entire class as a private button, submit button as an instance variable. So if it's a submit button is an instance variable for the entire class, then it's accessible within the entire class, right? So that way, button here is recognized. You could see the visibility change to blue color for this variable. That means the visibility is entire class. This is the entire class that you could go down here. Did I cut in something? It should be submit BT.
It was spelled wrong. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So if submit button had any event, what I need to do is quite straightforward. I could just use, you know, system.out.print colon and then print something. So you could even just type it in. This button is clicked. Okay. So if the events get the source and find out whatever happens in this GUI is the button has an event. I don't care what event it is. If it's a click, then tell me on the console this button is click. So at this point, you could run the Java application, and then you should see it. User input, and that's type in anything, right? Hit the submit. And you see the console right here, print out this button is click, right? So at least we know that, hey, you know, this is happening. We have a UI, the button is doing something. So obviously you could close it out. The easiest way to implement your text field is to print it out. Your event.
Professor, when I click the
Yes.
button, there's no text that appears. I don't know if I missed a line of code.
If you implement of everything that I said here, that you should work.
Yeah. Make sure you implement the private button.
Yeah, so make sure your submit button is actually
Like it runs.
Mm-hmm.
It runs. It's just when I like click
Okay,
submit.
so at this point, you know, I'm going to stop share. If you have any other GUI question, I'll be happy to